Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to the poem of the day for today, Saturday, November the 15th, 2025. So, kind of no poem today, actually. We're going to talk about the first canto of The Wasteland, which was the poem in my last video that I just sort of gave a little intro to. I read the poem and then didn't comment on because there's so much to say about all cantos of The Wasteland that I didn't want that video running terribly long. So today, I'm going to go through and do kind of a close reading of the first part of The Wasteland, which is Canto 1, The Burial of the Dead. And as I'll often say on here, there's so much more to say about these poems than I'm able to, contain within a single video or that I see upon every reading. And this is just all the more true with any T.S. Eliot, especially something like The Wasteland, which is regarded again as one of the most challenging, complex, but also important and high quality poems in the English language, in the American tradition, in the British tradition, and all the English language. So that's a little bit daunting and intimidating to try to tackle in a video like this, but any little bit is better than nothing. So I actually want to start by going back to the title page, because I read the translation of the title page, and I didn't really talk much about the allusions that are in there. Remember, there's I think four different languages in the title page itself. There's Latin, there's Greek, there's English, and then there's Italian. So the dedication is to Ezra Pound, which he calls in Italian the better craftsman. And all we need to know really about that, I think, is that Ezra Pound was an influence on Eliot and kind of an editor for Eliot, almost a co-writer of The Wasteland, just in the sense of the extensive detail of the notes that he gave him. We'll talk more about that, especially when we get to Canto 4. But the dedication in Italian is to the better craftsman. And the phrase echoes the tribute offered by Dante to the poet Arnaud Daniel in Canto 26 of the Purgatorio. So I'm reading a lot from the notes at the bottom of the page, but this is one of many allusions to older texts that Eliot's going to make throughout because of the importance that he places upon style and tradition. But also it's important for us to look at the allusions that we're going to see to Dante and to Dante's Divine Comedy, because if you know anything about that, you know that the poet Virgil is taking the speaker on a tour through the underworld, basically, or through the three places one might go in the Christian tradition after one's death. So here, by alluding to the Purgatorio, it seems as though Eliot is sort of assigning Ezra Pound to the role not just of my editor, but also my guide. You're my Virgil through all of this. But it also lets us know that the Wasteland is going to be kind of about hell and hell on earth. More on that later. So the actual epigraph at the beginning is translated as I read earlier, for once I saw with my own eyes the Cumaean Sibyl hanging in a jar. And when the boys asked her, Sibyl, what do you want? She answered, I want to die. And it says in here that Sibyl was granted a wish by Apollo, and she asked for as many years of life as there are grains in a handful of sand. But she forgot to ask for eternal youth as well. So she's living almost eternally within this jar, right? How many grains in a handful of sand? We're talking, tens of thousands or something. But she doesn't ask for youth, so she's old and she's decaying while she's in there. This is an interesting note. In the remake of Suspiria by Luca Guadagnino, near the end of that, when Mother Suspiriorum appears, she says to one of the young women in the coven, what do you want, my dear? And she says, I wish to die. And then she says, so be it, and lets her die. I think that's just kind of an interesting connection, perhaps intentionally or not. So then we go to the burial of the dead. Oh, sorry, just the comment on Sibyl. So that's an image of something that is, again, eternal and does not die, but is in this state of agony and pain and decay. And that's something else that we'll see throughout the rest of the poem. So, Canto 1, The Burial of the Dead, the title is an allusion to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. That's the name of the burial service. So, again, before we're even starting the poem, we're getting another reference to a religious or spiritual tradition that is focused on ways of recognizing and honoring and attempting for humans to deal with the prospect of death, loss, change, annihilation, the anxiety of what comes after. So the first stanza here, I believe, is in one person's voice. Eliot does not tell us when the voices are going to shift. I think sometimes it happens within a canto, or I'm sorry, within a stanza, just line to line. But I think the whole first stanza is one person, although we could have kind of a disembodied narrator. For sure, a speaker comes in about line 8. Summer surprised us coming over the Starnbergesa, because that's giving us um, it's telling us a story within the past. It's telling a story about an experience that this person has with other people, and it gives us a location in Germany. But within those first 7 lines, there's these disorienting kind of oxymorons or paradoxes. April is the cruelest month, right? And that right away takes us, kind of turns on its head this idea of March comes in like a lion, goes out like a lamb, right? And that April usually represents the kind of more tumultuous storms of March are gone, and April is usually April showers bring May flowers, right? It's usually more bucolic, pastoral, and promising that there is new life coming forth. But here the speaker is telling us the cruelest of month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And so what they're finding cruel is the promise that April brings of renewal out of the dead every single time, that death was not a finality, but that something is going to grow out of it. And then that again is going to die again. It seems as though the speaker is finding something particularly mournful or melancholic about this idea that death isn't final and that we're always going to have to go through these repeated cycles of death. Life also, but they're not really focused on the life aspect here. Then we get this, so mixing memory and desire, I think, is just a really interesting line there. And I'm not really sure, I have to be honest, I'm not really sure what to do with it, but this time I've really been focused on the memory, mixing memory and desire. And all of those initial lines have a enjambment to them, right? So April's the cruelest month, comma, breeding, and then it goes right into the next. Lilacs out of the dead land, comma, mixing memory and desire, comma, stirring dull roots with spring rain. So they're all these almost not incomplete, but almost like over expanded or overstuffed verses, because Eliot doesn't establish a strict metrical structure here. So there's no reason really why he has to fit the breeding and the mixing and the stirring onto those lines, but it creates a kind of winding aspect to it. The idea of something that's in flow, that one thing leads to a next. Winter kept us warm is another one of these paradoxes, right? Because usually we associate winter with things being cold and frigid, although it's really beautiful here today. And I know we're not in winter, but it's unseasonably warm for November the 15th. And the warmness here, again, we get this swaying of lines with covering and feeding. It covers the earth in forgetful snow. And so what I think the speaker is focusing on here is the way in which the snow of winter creates a beautiful white shining blanket, immaculate, untarnished, over this land that is a site of so much decay and death, right? It says dead land. And when this is coming out in 1922, we also have to be thinking about the destruction that has happened to the land from the First World War. And so the speaker seems to be calling back to and desiring all of that being covered over in a blanket of snow, because it also somewhat covers over our memories of all of that loss and all of that destruction. In the second half of this stanza, we get this story about, the rain shower, being out in the sunlight, drinking coffee and talking. We get a line in here that is in German, which translates as, I'm not a Russian at all. I come from Lithuania, a true German. So we have within here as well somebody who is like a migrant who has moved places and who is being perhaps provoked out of suspicion to state, what their allegiance is or what their nationality is. And we don't really get the line that provokes that, but nonetheless, that's a fragment that we get there. And then there's a sledding incident, right, where going on a sled and I was frightened, hold on tight, and down we went. And at the end, I read much of the night and go south in the winter. Um, Going south in the winter, we think of kind of the birds going over, right? But then the winter is the thing that keeps the person warm, and perhaps there's a connection there. So then we get to the second stanza around line 19, and I think we have a new speaker here, but we're again kind of dislocated within this hovering or this spiritual space where we're going to get a series of these images of roots clutching, branches growing, a heap of broken images, the sun beating down. There are references here to Ezekiel, right, the son of man. So that's one of the prophets. The crickets getting no relief is a reference to the book of Ecclesiastes, which goes to that, all is vanity line. So there's this recognition of like the things that one loses and the beauty that decays as one gets older. So we can hear that echoing throughout the poem. And that the dead tree gives no shelter. No shelter from the hard beating sun, no shelter from the rain. And this is another image of death and decay within the natural world that's here. But then we get a interjection that's like another voice, I think, right around only there is no shadow under this red rock. And then we get a parenthetical, come in under the shadow of this red rock. So it seems to be this kind of voice that's enticing or kind of calling in the speaker to go under the rock nonetheless. And then what goes with that is, and I will show you something different from either. Your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. And this is a line that was previously in T.S. Eliot's The Death of St. Narcissus, which was not a published poem. He kind of scavenged these, but Narcissus, I don't really know much about St. Narcissus. I know Narcissus from Ovid. And from Ovid, it's where narcissism comes from, right? The beautiful young man that stares upon his reflection in the water and becomes so enamored with himself that he falls in and drowns, which we're going to get a lot of like death by water throughout this poem, fear of drowning, right? The idea that water can be both a source of renewal and life, but also of destruction, drowning, death, and washing things away, decaying and eroding them. And then we get this really wonderful line, I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And I think what's so wonderful about that is knowing that Eliot is brought up in the Christian tradition. There's this allusion here to remember that you are dust and to dust you shall return, which is the words that are spoken at Ash Wednesday as a reminder of, the palms that were burned on Palm Sunday, the palms that welcomed Christ into Jerusalem the week of his passion. They're burned and turned into these ashes that are placed upon the foreheads of the faithful to remind them of their own mortality. And that's what this fear in a handful of dust is, because it also calls back to Sybil on the front page, and she wishes for as many years as there are in a handful of sand. So the handful of sand and the handful of dust, I think, are united together in this fear of wasting away, of not just death, but a decay, right? The loss of one's faculties, the loss of beauty and enchantment, not only within oneself, but also within the world. We then get this German song right in the middle, 4 lines of German song that translates as, fresh blows the wind to the homeland, my Irish child, where do you wait? And these are from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. I don't know a whole lot about Tristan and Isolde, but I do know that our note tells us that Wagner's source comes from the Arthurian literature and thus became associated with the Grail legend, which Eliot is going to refer to later in the poem. So we're getting the setup here of, excuse me, not only again a German speaker within the poem, another language, another kind of untranslated fragment for us, but an allusion to a different piece of art or literature here, and one that is um, referring back to myths and legends. And the search for the Grail, right, is a search for not only the cup that was used at the Last Supper by Christ, but also the idea that drinking from it would give you an everlasting life. So we can think of this again in connection with Sybil and the death and the decay. So much of this poem rhymes, even though it doesn't literally rhyme, right? We then get another speaker about the hyacinth girl that she says. And hyacinths, this is a reference to Ovid because the hyacinth is named after, I think it was Hyacinthus, who was a beautiful young man who was in love with Apollo, and Apollo was in love with him, and they went bounding through the fields and played discus. And Apollo, being a god, throws the discus so high into the air, and Hyacinthus goes running after it to try to catch it, but it comes down and it hits and it bounces and hits him in the head and kills him. And then there's this whole lament about that and the death of the beauty of this person who tried to frolic and play with the gods. So it's a little bit of a warning about that. And so we get this reference here to the hyacinth girl in the hyacinth garden. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light and silence, neither living or dead. So the speaker is placing oneself within both, I think, a kind of spiritual and existential turmoil where you're alive, but you're not truly living, where you feel depressed and maybe death fixated, but you're not actually dead. But also this kind of liminal space where spirits of the afterlife kind of float, right? You're still animated, you're still alive, but not really because you've died. But there's that thing, whatever it is, that thing that kind of goes on after. What's left after the material is gone? What's left of the spirit? At the end of this, we get another reference within the same stanza to Tristan and Isolde, and it translates as "Desolate and empty is the sea." And it's taken from the third act, and it occurs as the dying Tristan waits for Isolde arriving by sea. I don't know if I need to comment on this again, but certainly you can hear Eliot's fixation on water and water as a place of death. Then, new stanza, and I believe we have a different speaker, more kind of objective and bird's eye view here, not giving us direct quotes, more like a narrator of the poem, even though I don't think any of the narrators are authoritative or even necessarily consistent. And we have this episode with Madame Sosostris, the famous clairvoyant. Now, here's what's really cool about this, is that's a name taken from Aldous Huxley's novel Chrome Yellow, which comes out in 1921. This poem's written in 1922, or published in 1922. So Eliot, within the first 43-ish lines, is making all of these allusions to different myths and traditions and literatures and services and belief systems, most of them being ancient, right? We talked about Ovid, we talked about Dante, we talked about the New Testament. Here's one that's coming from the year before he publishes his own poem. So he's also pulling from contemporary works, but contemporary works that he's finding to be very rich and important and thoughtful. This is something that is often associated more with postmodernism than it is with modernism. And that's the idea of kind of the democracy or the leveling out of references to specific types of art living within the same art piece itself, living within the same piece of literature. That typically the modernists were ones who were going to look back, and the postmodernists were the ones who were going to sever connections with that tradition and focus more on things that were like pop, for example. Thomas Pynchon has all these things about like Beatles imitation bands and whatnot going on in there. And so Eliot's doing that a little bit here. And I don't think he would have said that, just because Huxley was a contemporary, that his work was less significant. If I recall, he was pretty impressed with the things that Huxley was doing. I've not read Chrome Yellow. I've only read Brave New World of Huxley's. But I'm curious to see if one does that, what other interesting revelations that would surface for us. And this Madame Sosostris has a bad cold, so we have this illness in here. But she has a pack of tarot cards. And that's what we're going to get played out in these tarot cards. Tarot cards are supposed to be able to read the person and tell their fortune, tell their future. it's a form of forecasting that relies upon a belief system, but one that's not thought of as specifically religious, even if it is kind of metaphysical. And again, it's interesting that Eliot is placing this thing that's seen as being perhaps by a lot of people epistemically suspect, magic, quote unquote, magical thinking, placing it within the same canto as something that people regard a little bit more highly, like the Judeo-Christian tradition. But he's placing both of those together as if to say, we don't know which one of these is actually going to bear out something that correlates more to the real world. And look, the first card that's pulled, the drowned Phoenician sailor. We get this drowning again, and it's going to come back later. And right after the drowned sailor, we get this parenthetical. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look. And the parenthetical jumps in, I think, interestingly, almost as a like second voice in your head when you are recalling like a line from a movie or a lyric from a song. So a lot of us, when we have our interior monologues going throughout the day, you know, you're thinking about something and then you hear whatever, and all of a sudden there's just kind of like a line in your head or a line from a commercial that just kind of pops back in, right? And you can hear it again. And that's, I think, what happens right here on the level of consciousness, that the Phoenician sailor, oh, the Phoenician sailor's drowned. What else do I know about drowning? Those are pearls that were his eyes. That's a line from The Tempest, wherein Ariel is singing about the drowned Ferdinand. I'm sorry, the drowned, it's the king, it's Ferdinand's father, who is supposedly drowned. He's not. We find him later in the play. But, he's talking about the pearls of the sea having been previously the drowned person's eyes. And we get the Belladonna, the Lady of the Rocks. We have a reference here to this wheel. Now, what's interesting about this wheel is an authentic tarot card, but the one-eyed merchant that's mentioned is a tarot card that Eliot makes up himself. So we have that tradition that's brought in about forecasting one's fortune or one's future, and then Eliot is immediately kind of fictionalizing it by throwing something else in there, and it makes you ask the question, you know, if you're going to believe or give any sort of credence to tarot, is that kind of a locked system of belief, or could one just fictionally throw in another possible card that would bear something out? And who's to say necessarily that that doesn't have the same kind of amount of power? I think that's just an interesting idea here. Within the stanza, we then get these wonderful lines. I do not find the hanged man. Fear death by water. There it is again. Now, forecast, I believe part 4 of the poem is called Death by Water. So just put that in the back of your mind for now. And then at the end, the Madame Sosostris is talking about, I see crowds of people walking round in a ring. So a whole bunch of people just kind of like pacing around in a circle. Not ending, not beginning, not going anywhere, not coming from anywhere. And then says, I'm going to have to bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. So there's a sense of threat and paranoia at the end of this, because the horoscope, the promise, the reading of the future, is something that is really privileged and private and important information. We can't trust it with anybody else. Eliot then transitions, I think, from the mention of the walking around in a ring to that actual image itself. And, oh, by the way, this is my Latte Larry's cup. So if you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, there's a season, was it 9 or 10 maybe, that's basically centered around a spite store that Larry makes next to Mocha Joe's, and it's called Latte Larry's. And so I have a cup from Latte Larry's, but it's not self-heating like Larry's aren't. Anyway, back to the Wasteland. So we go right into Unreal City. Unreal City. This is such a fascinating place within the poem, because what does it mean for something to be unreal? Is it fake? Is it fictitious? Is it a fantasy? Is it something that was real that has lost its realness? And what does it mean for a city to lose its realness? I always think of the Unreal City here as almost being, excuse me, like in Stranger Things, like the Upside Down. I imagine it almost as, even though Eliot doesn't describe it this way, as like there's the real city on top, and then this is its shadow. This is its doppelganger that's flipped on the upside down. And yet, rather than being real and full of life, this thing is unreal and is just the wanderings of the dead. And we get images like that where he talks about the brown fog over the winter dawn. And you could think back to Prufrock and talking about the way that he's just so interested in London and the detritus or the spill off of the industrial aspect of London, and that it hangs like a fog, but it's also a fog that kind of winds with an insidious intention. And we have it's winter again. We have a crowd flowing over London Bridge. So many. I had not thought that death had undone so many. Now, here's where we get a mixture of the unreal to the real, because this is a reference to another passage from Dante's Inferno, Canto 3, right outside the gates of hell. And Dante delivers the exclamation of, the hell and limbo area. These are the people who died without baptism. They languish, sighing impotently, for there is nothing that can be done about their condition. People dying without baptism, they're not far down in hell. They're not suffering. They're in this kind of first level where they weren't really allowed into the kingdom because you have to be baptized in that world in order to be into the kingdom. But they are nonetheless kind of in a state of spiritual agony. Again, if we read this as referring very specifically to London after the end of the First World War, it's I think that whole generation of men and of the youth that were lost, that were sacrificed for some sort of thing that was bigger than themselves, that they weren't really responsible for or the cause of, and their lives being lost in this vast number and not sanctified. I think Eliot is saying that they still kind of wander the streets looking for some sort of salvation as souls. And he says that their sighs are short and infrequent. They're exhaled, each man's eyes fixed on the street. So they're kind of staring down and just shuffling, and as they shuffle. And then, so it's a whole sea of these people flowing away to King William Street, St. Mary Woolnoth. These are very specific places in London. So again, we're an unreal city, but then he's describing it very, very specifically as a real city, which is London, with places that you can identify and kind of map out. And then there's somebody that cries out, "Stetson, you were with me on the ships of my lee." Well, I just said that perhaps this was people who had died in World War I, but if we look at the note for the ships of my lee, this is referring to the battle in the First Punic War of 206 BCE between Rome and Carthage. So who are these people? And I think it could be, just all the lost and the dead who died in violent wars, who were sacrificed in violent wars, again, fighting for stuff outside of or beyond their own will or control. Or perhaps Eliot is suggesting that there's a cycle to this death, that all the wars that we're fighting now are rehashes and replays and recyclings of the previous large-scale acts of barbarianism that we've had throughout our culture. And that death unites people, these soldiers, across eras, across centuries, across nations and countries, because they've all been kind of undone for the sake of their city, and they're left just shuffling about alone. And then there's this wonderful line, that corpse that you planted last year in your garden has begun to sprout. Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men. Or with his nails, he'll dig it up again. So they're asking about a corpse you planted, and is the corpse sprouting? Will it bloom this year? So how long has it been in there, right? And then there's the frost over it, which kind of reminds us to the snow-covered, right? Winter kept us warm and snow covered it, but then he's warning him that this dog is going to dig the body up. And this line is kind of borrowed from a dirge in John Webster's The White Devil, where Cornelia is preparing her son's body for burial. So I think on the surface, this line sounds like, oh, that body you planted in your backyard. It sounds like somebody that you murdered and you were trying to hide, like pour lime on them before the cops find them or something. But it's all, the allusion tells us that it's the burial of kind of one's beloved family members, right? One's brother, for example. And then the last line we get is this French translation: "Hypocrite reader, my likeness, my brother." And it is the final line of Baudelaire's Au lecteur, right? To the reader. And that line, "You hypocrite reader, my likeness, my brother," it brings the whole canto to a close with, again, a reference to the symbolist poet Baudelaire. And it's not really clear who's saying it. It could be the same person who's talking about, like, beware of the corpse sprouting. But it also at the same time calls out to you and I, the person who are reading the poems, and it's saying that you are also our kin. You are just like us. And that's where the first stanza is going to leave us, is this call out to us that all of these scrambled and fragmented things, don't let them sort of alienate you or push you apart, because you're a part of this too. You're in this poem as well. It's an action that understands and calls us out and acknowledges and recognizes us as a part of this larger story. So that's some thoughts on Canto 1, The Burial of the Dead. Again, far more many things one could say, but I'm running up on 31 minutes here, and I think that was a good enough place to gather some symbols and some ideas that we can then trace throughout the remaining cantos. So hopefully you found this helpful, and if there's other things that you would like to say about Canto 1, I'd be really happy to read about them. And Canto 2 shortly. So thank you, and have a lovely day, and may peace be with you.